So when you take into consideration the IPCC's report from about a month ago that gives humanity about 12 years to act if we want to avert a climate catastrophe, along with the multi-agency report recently released by the US government that says if we don't act, not only will the US economy suffer due to climate change, but it's going to kill thousands of people every single year, it seems as if the situation is it's not looking too good for humanity. So I think that there's a select few politicians in the country that not only understand the urgency in terms of our need to act, but also understands what could galvanize support for legislation that would actually target and mitigate and potentially help us even adapt to the effects of climate change. And those people are Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, perhaps any Democrat who's co-sponsoring or supporting, rather, her Green New Deal initiative, and Bernie Sanders, who is realizing that, look, since we're not acting when it comes to climate change because we're worried about the economic ramifications if we take swift action, he's framing the debate in an economic way, and I think that that is absolutely the correct way to win over support. So here's what he said about climate change in an interview with John Berman on CNN.
There was a report, as you know, that just came out last week from 13 government agencies, which is dealing with the crisis facing us in terms of climate change.
Yep.
And what these agencies are telling us, if we do not get our act together and cut in a significant way carbon emissions, what you're going to be looking at are more wildfires like we have seen in California. You're going to see more rising sea levels. You're going to see more drought and more flooding. We have got to address that issue.
And that was the report. It was released by the Trump administration on the Friday after Thanksgiving.
Reluctantly released by the Trump administration.
Maybe on a Friday after Thanksgiving to minimize the impact it had. But my question for you is, with only a Democratic House, a Republican Senate, and a Republican president, what legislation? What do you want to see politicians in Washington do practically now?
But you see, you're using the word practically. Do you know what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said? They said that if we don't get our act together within 12 years, not a long period of time, there's going to be irreparable harm to this planet. So the point is, the American people have got to stand up and say that for the sake of their children and their grandchildren, we have got to have to take on the greed of the fossil fuel industry, who consider their short-term profits more important than the kind of lives my grandchildren are going to have.
You don't have to convince me that it's a serious issue. You have to convince Republicans in the Senate and Republicans in the White House.
No, I have to convince the American people to tell Republicans. So we have an international crisis. We've got to work with other countries around the world. And here's the good news, John. When we do that, we're going to create millions of jobs through increasing energy efficiency and moving toward wind, solar, and other sustainable energy. Look, here's the point. The scientists have told us, despite Trump's absurd thought that this is a hoax, that the future of the planet is at stake. Okay? Not a debatable issue to my mind. So we have got to have the courage to take on the greed of the fossil fuel industry. And by the way, if the House can send us a serious bill, I think you will be surprised at the number of Republicans who will not choose to be voting against it.
So what he said there is crucial. The government's not going to act when it comes to climate change. These reports that keep getting released that essentially warn us about how climate change is going to wipe out thousands of species, pose an existential threat to humanity, that's not going to compel them. The facts, the science is not going to get these Republicans who have been bought off by the oil and gas industry to suddenly change their mind. Because a lot of these Republican Party politicians, let's face it, to be blunt, they're going to die soon. They're super old. So they don't necessarily care because they're not going to see the worst of what climate change has to offer. But millennials like myself, when we're their age, our lives are going to be hell because we're already seeing the effects of climate change. Unprecedented wildfires in California, rising sea levels already. That's affecting small island communities. It's going to be bad. And in our lifetimes, we may witness wars over water. So we absolutely have to act, but these reports that warn us of all the terrible things that will come to fruition as a result of climate change, that's not going to convince Republicans. So what Bernie Sanders says here is exactly what needs to happen. Quote, "The American people have got to stand up and say, for the sake of their children and grandchildren, we are going to have to take on the greed of the fossil fuel industry, who consider their short-term profits more important than the lives of my grandchildren." And he added, "I have to convince the American people to tell Republicans to take action." That's what's going to get them to take action. We can't wait for us to have campaign finance reform and get money out of politics so that way they're uncorrupted. We don't have time. Our only move, if we want action, is to mobilize, is to stand up, is to do what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did and hundreds of activists did who occupied Nancy Pelosi's office and demanded that she take action. And you know what? That worked. Because she immediately offered to reinstate a committee on climate change. Now look, that's just a baby step in the right direction, but it's a snapshot of what could happen if we were to see that level of dedication and mobilization on a national level. Can you imagine if in every single major city of this country, hundreds of thousands of Americans marched and demanded action on climate change? It would really make a pretty big difference. And certainly, I don't think we would convince every single Republican. I don't even think we'd convince a majority of Republicans. But what we would do is scare the shit out of them. What we would do is draw attention to an issue that gets ignored all too often, given the salience of this issue. I mean, this is the existence of not just humanity, but thousands of species on the planet that's at stake here, that could go extinct if we don't act. Rising sea levels, ocean acidification, desertification, food and water shortages. I mean, it's a nightmare situation. And even if it's easy for us to kind of put it out of our heads, because that's way down the line, imagine how angry future generations are going to be at us for not taking action. Imagine how angry we're going to be at ourselves when we're older and we see how fucked up the planet is. Another thing Bernie says here, which is really an important component, is he talks about the economic opportunity that is presented to us with climate change. He says, we're going to create millions of jobs through increasing energy efficiency and moving towards wind, solar, and other sustainable energy. That's important because if you frame this in terms of the economic benefits of climate change, I think that moves the Overton window, because up till this point, we've only been talking about the downside of climate change reform with regard to the economy. Oh, this will lead to lost profits and lost jobs. But what Bernie Sanders is saying here, and I think he's one of the first people to say this, is that no, you're looking at it all wrong. You're thinking about this in an antiquated way. What climate change does is it prevents us with an opportunity to be a world leader, to be a driving force in the international economy when it comes to green and clean and renewable technology. But we're not acting because the fossil fuel industry has bought off an entire party. It's bought off some Democrats, not to the point where they'll deny the existence of anthropogenic climate change, but certainly bought them off to the point where they'll shut up. Now, the one thing that Bernie Sanders said in this interview that kind of caught me off guard was that he indicated that in the event the House were to send the Senate a solid climate change bill, it might actually pass in the Senate. I have no idea what he's talking about because I wouldn't necessarily expect that to be the case, given that Republicans still control the Senate. And they are bought and paid for by the oil and gas industry, but it's Bernie. So maybe he has something up his sleeve. Maybe he's going to call for mobilization. Maybe the Democratic Party has a plan that is being led by Bernie Sanders, or maybe he's strong-arming them to do something in the event. Maybe he's planning something. We don't know what's going on behind closed doors, but that certainly caught me off guard. I'm skeptical. I think maybe Bernie Sanders is being a bit more optimistic than I am here. Maybe I'm just too cynical, but look, if that's the case, that would be wonderful. Would Donald Trump sign it? Not necessarily, unless we put pressure on him. But I think that the main thing, or the main two things really that Bernie Sanders is saying that's important is, one, he's saying we're not going to get action and we shouldn't expect action unless we mobilize, we take to the streets. And two, we have to talk about the economic benefits of climate change, how this would be an economic boon in the event we invested and subsidized clean, renewable technology. So it's why Bernie Sanders is the only 2020 presidential contender that actually gives me hope, because he is our only hope. And I don't like to say things like that because it seems as if, there's this cult of personality around Bernie Sanders, and I don't believe that that's the case, because progressives have been very clear about their criticisms with Bernie Sanders. Some criticisms with regard to foreign policy and Israel-Palestine. But with that being said, he's our only hope, not just for the United States, but the planet. So if we know what's good for us, we'll elect him president and get him through a Democratic Party primary in 2020, because I just don't know anyone else who has the political will and political intuition that Bernie Sanders has.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.